Welcome back everybody. Today I'm making a video series about real-time game ready hair. This first part is going to cover the basic techniques and the first step into creating your hair textures. This tutorial is going to be utilizing Maya's XGen system. The first step in creating any hair is understanding how hair is even created in games, because you can't really create meshes for every hair strand on the head, because then the entire mesh is going to be way too dense with polygons and the engine is not going to be able to handle that kind of rendering. So the way that we create hair in games is by utilizing something called hair cards. And hair cards simulate the existence of hair, but reducing the number of polygons tremendously. And hair cards are similar to retopologizing in the way that we create actual dense hair that can't really be used in engine, and then we take the textures and put it on a flat plane so we can then place it on our characters with almost the same level of detail but with infinitely less polygons. So it's similar to retopology in that sense. As you can see here, I'm having a couple of examples of hair cards, and hair cards need to be made into different levels of density and occlusion. See, there are multiple different layers to hair being made. There is what's called the base layer, there is the primary layer, the secondary layer, the tertiary layer, and the flyaways. And the base layer is essentially the most dense card texture that you have, that has almost zero see-through. You cannot see through it. And the base layer is used usually for the scalp mainly, to cover the head of the mesh. The primary layer is usually also very dense, but you can have slight occlusions. Over here, this middle piece, as you can see here, is a primary area. It's very dense, but it is not so dense that you cannot see through it at all. And there are multiple primary layers, as you can see here. And usually when we're creating high quality grooms, we want to mix and match between layers to create variety in our hairs so that it doesn't look too samey. The secondary layer, as the name might imply, is supposed to be the layer that goes on top of the primary layer, and it is supposed to help differentiate the hairs slightly so that it doesn't look too predictable, so that there are more variety and more noise in the hair. The tertiary area is the topmost area that still adheres to the hair, and it's usually light, but it still has a certain level of volume to it. And this is probably the most important layer, because it is the outermost layer and the layer that people see or players see in your game. So you need to make sure that it looks good and doesn't have artifacting and the placement makes sense. The flyaway is, as the name might imply, it's the very few strands that you see hanging off to the side in hair, because hair isn't 100% uniform. There will always be a couple of strands that doesn't go where you want it to go, and that kind of layering adds the final piece of realism to your hair. If the hair doesn't have good flyaways, or it doesn't have flyaways at all, the hair will end up looking incredibly static and it will look like a helmet. Flyaways are incredibly important in adding realism to your grooves. Over here on the side, you can see a couple of examples on how hair cards are supposed to look when they're finished being placed on the head. And yeah, they're supposed to look something like this. You're placing them in a similar manner to how actual hair is being placed. You might think that you know how hair looks and stuff like that, and you might not need references, but trust me, the deeper levels of detail will always escape you, because when we see something so often like hair on the heads of people, you end up being so used to it that you end up overlooking some of the most finer details. And so making hair from your mind will almost never work. You always want to see hairstyles and how the hair goes, how it flows, how the flyaways act, how the secondary and tertiary area act on the top of the head, the general flow, everything. It is crucial. You need to always look at references. Now, if you're wondering what the program I'm using here that has all of these images, I will have a link to it down in the description. It's called PureRef, and it's a free program. It's an incredible program that is used by millions of artists around the world, and it has incredible options like how it can always stay on top even if you're using another program. So you can have it off to the side like this, and even though you're working on another program, it's not going to be put behind the other program. And it has other features like how it doesn't get moved so you don't click it accidentally or something like that. It's a very good app that's always being used by artists and game developers. And for the reference images, I just go on Pinterest or ArtStation and I just look for images that fit what I need, and I just put them over into this program, PureRef, and I work from there. You can also use anime or animated hairstyles if you want a less realistic groom. This works fine. And a personal recommendation for me, if you're just starting out new, looking at Square Enix games hair is a good recommendation in my opinion, because as you can see here in these Final Fantasy grooms and whatnot, the hairstyles are simple enough to the point where you can, as a noob, replicate some of them or copy some of them, but they're also adhering to the industry standard basics. And that's the most important thing, is if you take an incredibly complicated groom like the one used in Horizon, for example, Aloy in Horizon has an incredibly complicated looking groom. It's very impressive, it's incredibly impressive, but it is very difficult. On the other hand, other games like Final Fantasy and generally all Square Enix games, they use these grooms that look really good and use all of the basics that you need in hair grooming, but at the same time the hairstyles do not look overly complicated, so you can take them as a reference as well. You can also take other general 3D hair designs as references, which is fine, but a recommendation from me is you should not work solely off of 3D artists' grooms, because no one is perfect and everyone will make mistakes. And if you take an artist's groom and take it as a reference, you will also be copying their mistakes, and you do not want that, because as you can see here, when you compare the real life hairstyles with the groom hairstyles, the real life hair will always look better and it will always look more realistic. And that's because no one can ever truly replicate the real life hair. And so if you take 3D designed hair solely as your reference, you will end up copying over or adhering to the mistakes that 3D artist did. So with that out of the way, I will now introduce you to the workflow of this series. And the first step is creating the hair texture. As I already previously mentioned, you can create the hair texture in multiple different programs. Blender has it, but Blender is very primitive, so it doesn't have a lot of option and it doesn't look that realistic. Photoshop is supposed to be the industry standard, and it is the highest quality, and it's also free, but at the same time, for the free version you cannot export textures higher than 1K, I believe, so you can't really export high quality textures for free. You need to buy the program if you want to export 4K textures, for example. Maya's XGen for me is an incredibly versatile and an incredible software altogether, and that's what I will be using for the creation of this hair texture. So without further ado, when you start over in Maya over here, you want first to create a plane, and this plane is going to be our hair cards. Now some people will, after creating this plane, will just end up selecting the edges like this and extruding them up. Then they will delete all of these faces and then separate every mesh separately so that they have separate different planes, like the way that you're seeing over here. However, personally, I do not recommend this, because now each and every single one of these surfaces are single faces only, and when they are single faces only, you're not gonna be able to entirely fill the whole card with hair, and you kind of want that because you do not want there to be any dead space in your mesh. So what I would recommend doing, if you followed this process up to now, you can just end up selecting all of these faces and going up to edit mesh and subdividing it multiple times until you have like 16 faces inside each and every one of these single planes. That's what I end up doing. Now I'm going to be having only one base layer hair card, and I will have 3 primary hair cards, 3 secondary, 3 tertiary, and 3 flyaways, or more flyaways. Like flyaways are fine if you have more. And I will also be creating a set of short hairs so that they can be used in beards, mustaches, or eyelashes. A lot of videos on the internet and tutorials will always tell you that you should be creating and drawing guidelines for your hair to go, and a lot of people use Photoshop for that, but personally I have a different opinion from them. For me, when you're starting as a complete noob and you have zero experience creating hair cards, you do not want to overcomplicate the process, because hair creation is already an incredibly difficult thing to do, and creating your first groom will almost always be a failure in one way or another. Everyone is bound to make mistakes, and when you're trying for the first time to do something that is very difficult, you're bound to fail at a certain part or at a certain point and mess up. And so dedicating something like guidelines to something that is going to not look great, in my opinion, is a waste of time. The way that I went about learning hair creation was I just winged it, and I created hair that I felt looked fine, and I just went about multiple projects doing that before I finally started feeling comfortable and actually working professionally with that in mind. Then I started actually creating guides and drawing out silhouettes for the hair inside Photoshop, and then working my hair over it. And that's how I recommend you start over it, because creating guides and drawings into Photoshop is already time consuming enough, and when you do not know what you're doing really, when you're just starting out, This just feels like a waste of time. You should just go by feel and create what you feel looks nice. And once you finally feel comfortable enough and you feel like you've learned enough, then you can just end up going professional and drawing out everything. For the first hair that I'm creating a description and a collection. Since this is the first time, you need to create a collection that's going to contain all of your descriptions. And leave everything as default except for the final one. You need to select the first option. By the way, this isn't a tutorial on how to use Xgen. There are plenty of tutorials out there. I'm going into this with the expectation that you are at an intermediate level with Xgen at least. You don't need to be a professional or anything, but you need to know how to do the basics, and that's it. If you want a full tutorial guiding you through the basics of Xgen, write that down in the comment section and I will create a video guiding you through the most basic parts of creating hair in this wonderful system in Maya. Pro tip, make sure you save frequently, because Xgen is by far the most unstable part of Maya and it can crash often, and sometimes the Xgen files get corrupted and they do not get saved. Thankfully, creating hairs in Xgen doesn't take a long time. When you get comfortable with the software, you can easily create a full texture set in less than an hour. But still, it's better to be safe than sorry, and make sure that you save often. So when we start with the first primary layer, the main goal of this is to make the base layer incredibly dense with hair. You want to reduce the thickness of the hair a lot, especially if this is going to be a high-end card set. If you're making a stylized hair, or when you're creating a game that isn't very high fidelity, you can create thicker hair strands in general, it doesn't matter. But when you're creating high quality games, visually speaking, you need to reduce the thickness of the hair by a lot. Over here, I reduce the thickness of the hair to 0.02, and I reduce the thickness of the tips by half of the base. And you need to make the hair unbelievably dense, going with the density almost to like 300, to make sure that the opacity of the hair is reduced to almost zero. After I do that, I end up going to the modifiers tab, which is by far the most important tab in the whole program. And I end up adding a couple of modifiers like clumping, coil, noise, cut, to make the hair not uniform, so that it can have differences between them. Because that's the most important part of creating hair, is to make sure that the hair looks natural. And natural hair looks messy. You do not have hair that is completely flat. Hairs should flow, they have noise, they're not the same length, and so you need to introduce randomness to it at every corner you can. So just fiddle with it at your own whim. I would recommend you don't follow me. You do not follow what I'm doing. You should do it by heart and look at it, experiment with it, see what works and what doesn't, and create your own hair. However, the one thing that I do recommend you do is make sure that the hair doesn't go beyond the card itself, because you do not want the texture itself to be bendy. You want it to be generally straight. Unless you're making curly hair, you should always aim to not make the hair incredibly curvy, because you can end up curving the hair card itself even if it's straight. So curving it in the texture will just limit your options. After you've finished creating your hair in general, you can end up pressing 7 on your number pad, and it will bring up this opacity view, and this opacity will allow you to see just how see-through your hair is, because your hair might look very thick, but it will still have a lot of opacity, and this will end up appearing strongly in your hair card. So you should increase your density as you see fit, depending on the opacity of the hair itself. Now, this is pretty much everything. You just need to repeat this process over and over all of the other hair cards. With the secondary layer, I end up creating one description for all three of them, since they're all the same thickness, the same length, the same noise level, the same everything, that since they're all the same layer, so you can just create one description to reduce time and workload and just cut on your work time. But if you're just starting out learning Xgen, then you might not want to do this and do it for each and every single one of them to get a feel for the program and use it more often, so that you can learn more by working extra on it. But if you want to finish fast, then you can just do this trick that I'm doing over here. With the secondary layer, it's generally the same thing, it's just less dense with hair. Each layer should get less dense than the one before it. So the base layer is the most dense layer, the primary layer is less dense than it, and the secondary is less dense than the primary, so on and so forth. Until the flyaways, you should just have a couple of hair strands that you can count on one hand. Flyaways shouldn't really exceed more than 4 or 5 strands. Since the tertiary area is a lot less dense than the ones before it, I end up only using 3 guides instead of 5 to reduce the number of hairs. But other than that, it's the exact same as the layers before it. And for the flyaways, I end up using just a single mesh, because I don't think it's worth it to have separate meshes just to put 1 or 2 strands of hair on it. I just have one long mesh, and I'm just gonna put guides on it and have the density incredibly low, so that I can have separate little hair strands growing over each and every place, and I can just separately bake them and cut the mesh differently. As you can see here, I just have 1 or 2 strands in each and every little corner. If the hair placement is a little finicky and it's somewhat uncomfortable for you, you can end up changing the seed over in the primitives tab, and that ends up helping a lot here. As you can see here with the flyaways, there wasn't a lot of space between them, so cutting the image to have separate textures for each flyaway set is a little difficult. But changing the seed like that, you can end up getting a very satisfactory result. Now, this side looking plane is very similar to the flyaway plane. I'm making a one long plane and placing multiple guides on it, and I'm gonna make the hairs very short so that they can act like eyelashes and beards and stuff like that. Very short hair that can be used at some point. After we've pretty much finished with creating all of the hair textures that we're gonna need to work with, the way that we start to texture, to bake all of this information, normals, opacity, ambient occlusion, height maps, everything, I'm gonna be using X normal. You can bake all of these details in Maya, but the process is very complicated. It's long, it's tedious, it's not easy, it's hard to remember. I do not recommend texture baking in Maya. It's very high quality, it's very capable, but it is not basic, it's not easy, it's very hard. What I use is an industry standard program called XNormal, and XNormal is used by AAA game developers all around the world. It's an incredibly powerful software that ends up giving you all of the texture baking you might ever need with the simple click of a button. It's an amazing software. It's also free, by the way. I'll have a link to it down in the description. However, we cannot really texture bake the hair as it is right now. we need to turn this hair into a proper mesh with vertices on it. So the way that we do that is, after you've created all of your hair like this, you need to select all of the planes that are acting as the roots for our hair, and you need to press H to hide them. Then you want to select all of your descriptions in your outliner, and you need to go over here up top to this turn primitives to polygons button and just press it. It's gonna take a little while because your hair is very high res and it's incredibly dense, so the mesh is gonna be very heavy to turn into polygons. Just wait for it, and after it's done you will see that now it created a different mesh that is a perfect copy of your hair. You can go ahead and just hide the primitives and select all of your hairs, go up top to file, click on export selected, and export it as OBJ or OBJ export as it's written here, and export it somewhere you would like. And we're almost ready to start texture baking. But with this, I've pretty much finished the first part of this series. Next video I'll show you how to properly texture bake and set up your program to start placing hair cards. The third video will be finally actually starting creating the groom, where we place the hair cards properly, and probably that's gonna be the last video. Maybe I'll create a fourth video for tips and tricks, but we'll tackle that when we get there. Thank you very much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I hope we reach 1,000 subs soon. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.